There is a country in northeast Africa with more ancient pyramids than Egypt. It's not Egypt. Sudan has 255 pyramids. Egypt has 138. They are older, steeper, and most people have never seen a single photo of them. They're not on the cover of National Geographic. They're not in your school textbook. And the civilization that built them? They didn't just build pyramids. They conquered Egypt. They sat on the throne of the pharaohs. They ruled the most powerful empire on earth for nearly a century. Then Egypt rewrote its own history and pretended it never happened. This is the story of the Black Pharaohs, the 25th dynasty. And it's the most important story in this series that nobody is talking about. Here is what you were taught. Ancient Egypt, pharaohs, the Nile, pyramids at Giza, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra. End of story. What the textbook skips, for nearly 100 years, Egypt was ruled by a dynasty that came from the south, from the Kingdom of Kush, modern-day Sudan, a civilization that had existed alongside Egypt for over 1,000 years, that had traded with Egypt, fought Egypt, been dominated by Egypt, and then flipped it. In 747 BC, a Kushite king named King Piye marched his army north from his capital at Napata. He didn't sneak in. He didn't exploit a moment of weakness quietly. He fought his way through every major city in Egypt: Memphis, Hermopolis, Heliopolis. And when it was over, he stood in the great temple at Karnak and declared himself pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. He was Nubian. He was from Sudan. He was the most powerful man on earth. And when he went home, he had it carved on a stele, a stone monument, describing every city he took, every king who submitted. That stele is in the Cairo Museum right now. Piye was obsessed with Egyptian culture. Not in the way a tourist is obsessed. The Kushites had been studying, absorbing, and preserving Egyptian religious traditions for centuries. In some cases, more faithfully than the Egyptians themselves, who had drifted during periods of political chaos. When Piye arrived at Memphis, one of the first things he did was bathe in the Nile and enter the temple to worship Amun. He performed the rituals exactly as a true pharaoh should. The Egyptian priests accepted him. His victory stele doesn't read like a conqueror's trophy. It reads like a man who is coming home. And then he went back to Sudan. He left Egypt governed by local rulers who acknowledged his authority, returned to Napata, and appears to have spent the rest of his reign focused on his own kingdom. He didn't colonize Egypt. He didn't install Kushite culture over Egyptian culture. He restored order, performed the religious duties, and left. That is not how conquest usually works. His successors didn't go home. Shabaka, Shabiku, Taharqa, Tantamani, 4 kings of the 25th dynasty who ruled Egypt from the inside, who built temples, who restored monuments, who commissioned art in pure Egyptian style, who buried their dead in pyramids. Taharqa is the one you need to know. He ruled Egypt and Kush for 26 years, 690 to 664 BC. He built more monuments than any pharaoh in centuries. He restored temples across Egypt that had been neglected for generations. He managed a kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to deep into sub-Saharan Africa. He is mentioned in the Bible, chapter 2, Kings, verse 19. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib was threatening Jerusalem, King Hezekiah prayed for deliverance. The text says that Taharqa, king of Kush, marched out to fight the Assyrians. The king who saved Jerusalem was a Sudanese pharaoh. You were not told that. The Assyrians invaded Egypt in 671 BC under Esarhaddon, then again in 667 BC. then again. Taharqa fought them 3 times. He retook Memphis twice. He was a military commander operating on a scale almost no pharaoh had managed in a century. He was ultimately pushed south back into Sudan. The Assyrians installed a new Egyptian dynasty, the 26th, the Siat Pharaohs, and the Siat kings, establishing their own legitimacy, did what new dynasties do. They rewrote the record. The monuments the Kushite pharaohs had built were de-emphasized. Their names were removed from some inscriptions. The official story of Egypt moved forward as though the 25th dynasty had been an interruption, a foreign intrusion, rather than a century of rule by pharaohs who had performed every religious duty, built every monument, and governed with more Egyptian authenticity than half the dynasties that preceded them. That is the ancient erasure. The modern one is different, and in some ways more damaging. In the 19th century, Western Egyptology was dominated by a framework, sometimes stated explicitly, sometimes assumed, that located the most sophisticated ancient civilizations in the Mediterranean world and the Near East, and viewed sub-Saharan African civilizations as peripheral or derivative. The Pyramids of Sudan, Meroë, and Napata were discovered by European explorers and immediately attributed to Egyptian influence. The assumption was that civilization flowed north to south, that Kush had learned from Egypt, not the other way round. The possibility that the relationship was more complex, that Kush and Egypt had influenced each other across 1,000 years, that the Kushites were not imitating Egypt but had developed their own parallel civilization, was not seriously entertained. One Italian treasure hunter named Giuseppe Fellini arrived at Meroë in 1834. He tore the tops off 40 pyramids looking for gold. He found jewelry in one of them, which he sold in Europe to private collectors. The damage he did in a few weeks took the site a century to begin recovering from. In 2018, National Geographic ran a cover story on the Nubian pharaohs. It was, for many readers, the first time they had ever seen a photo of the pyramids at Meroë, the first time they'd ever heard of the name Taharqa. That cover story ran 2,700 years after Taharqa's reign. The pyramids at Meroë are still standing, steeper than the Egyptian pyramids, smaller, more of them, stretching across the Sudanese desert in a line that goes on for kilometers. Most of them were never opened by archaeologists. Some of them have been damaged by erosion, by Fellini, by neglect. The site has a UNESCO World Heritage status. In 2020, flooding from the Nile damaged several of the structures. The Sudanese government, managing a country in political turmoil with limited resources, is trying to preserve them. The most pyramid-rich country on Earth is watching its monuments deteriorate, and most of the world doesn't know they exist. The erasure of the Siat pharaohs began, diminishing the Kushite dynasty, reframing them as outsiders, was completed by centuries of Western scholarship that couldn't fit an African empire into the story it was trying to tell. Here is what is true. The Kingdom of Kush was not a footnote to Egyptian history. It was a parallel civilization over 1,000 years old, that at its peak absorbed Egypt, restored its temples, and produced pharaohs who governed with more religious and cultural fidelity than the dynasties on either side of them. Taharqa built a colonnade at Karnak that still stands. He built temples at Kawa, at Sanam, at Meroë. He is depicted on monuments in the pure Egyptian style, because he understood that style better than most Egyptians of his era. He tried to hold Egypt against the most powerful military force of the ancient Near East. He fought Assyria 3 times. He was a Sudanese king. He was a pharaoh of Egypt. He was mentioned in the Bible. And until 2008, most people had never heard his name. Egypt has 138 pyramids, Sudan has 255. And a king from Sudan once marched north, sat on the throne of the pharaohs, and held off the Assyrian Empire for 20 years. The next video, Rome, a slave with 78 followers and kitchen knives who built an army of 120,000. 6 Roman armies defeated, and when it was over, 6,000 bodies left on the roadside for months. Not as a punishment, as a message.